My dear brothers and sisters, human beings are always in search of happiness. We all search for happiness in different places and by different means. But all of us search for happiness in life. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher, very renowned philosopher. He died in the year 1804, but a very renowned philosopher. He gave this rule of life for happiness. He said, something to do, someone to love, something to hope for. That is the rule he gave for happiness. Something to do, someone to love, and something to hope for. In one sentence, he finished giving the rule of life for happiness. Something to do. We have to do something in our lives. God has blessed us with life, with gifts, and therefore we have to reciprocate. We are not called to bury the talents that God has given us. No matter what happens in life, no matter how many failures we meet in life, we are still called to do something good in life. Something good in life. Stephen Grillet was a missionary. He's a French missionary but worked in Canada and in the US. He very beautifully said, I shall pass this world but once. I shall pass this way but once. Let me do whatever good I can now. Let me not defer it or neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. Beautiful rule for life. I shall pass this way once. Let me do all the good I can now. Not defer it, not postpone it, or not neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. We may not have another chance to do good to the people that we meet in the way or a journey of life. So the time for us to do good is now. We have to do it now because we may not pass that way again. Something to do in our life. That is the first rule of life. Abraham Lincoln used to say, I would always like to be remembered as a person who plucked a weed and planted a flower instead. That's what he said. All my life, I would like to be remembered as a man who removed a weed and planted a flower instead. I want to be remembered as a man or a woman who has done good things in life. Something to leave behind. A fragrance that will attract and soothe and console somebody else. We are called to do something in life. We have to do something in life. Live a good imprint on the sands of time. We got to do something. In the poem H.W. Longfellow, on the ladder of Augustine, very beautiful poem, the ladder of Augustine would say, the heights by great men reached and kept. The heights by great men reached and kept were not done by sudden flights. They, while their companions slept, were toiling upward in the night. These are the deeds, good deeds of great men. When the others were sleeping, they, when their companions were asleep, were toiling in the night upwards. So we have got to do something good in life. That is the first principle for happiness in life. Something to do. The second principle that Immanuel Kant gives is somebody to love. Somebody to love. If there is no love in our heart, it will lead us to death. If there is no love in our heart, there is no meaningfulness in life. We need to love somebody, we need to love something. Not only for ourselves, but also for others. So there should be an ingredient of love in our hearts. Love should be there in our heart for somebody that will give us meaning in life. I would like to recommend a beautiful book that was written in the 20th century. This particular book is considered to be one of the 10 most influential books of the 20th century. Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning, written by Viktor Frankl. He was a Jew who was put in the concentration camp. And in the concentration camp, he was a psychiatrist from Austria. In the concentration camp, he witnessed the death of his father, who died of starvation and also tuberculosis. He witnessed the death of his mother and his brother, who was sent to the gas chambers. He also witnessed the death of his own wife with disease. And when he was in the concentration camp, he escaped. Fortunately, he lived in the concentration camp for 4 years, and he had seen death and misery of life at first hand. So after he came out of the concentration camp, he wrote a very beautiful book, and which he published in 1946, Man's Search for Meaning, wherein he says, many of the people who came to the concentration camp died before they were physically put to death. When they saw the conditions of life over there, misery of life and valueless of life, they said, when they saw those pathetic conditions, many of them died and they lost the will to live. But there were some of them who survived all these tortures and all these miseries in life because they had a meaning in life. They loved somebody beyond the concentration camp. They had somebody for whom they had to live. There was a mother, there was a father, or there was a spouse, or there were children outside the concentration camp, and therefore he had to survive. He had the will to survive because of them. He had love in his heart, and that made him to survive the miseries of the concentration camp. That gave him the meaning for his life. Man's search for meaning. We need to have someone to love in our life. That will give us happiness, that will give us meaning in life. I also remember a very famous poem by W.B. Yeats. An Irish airman foresees his death. Very beautiful poem. If you go, it's just about 16 lines. You should read that poem. An Irish airman foresees his death. He's a fighter pilot during the First World War. He was fighting on behalf of Britain, but he was an Irishman. And when he goes on the bomber, then he reflects and speaks to himself and says like this. He's not interested in life. He says, I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Then you should see the next 2 lines. Those that I fight, I do not hate them. Those that I fight, I do not hate them. Those that I guard, I do not love them. The reason he says is this. My country is Kiltartan's Cross. That is one place in Ireland. My country is Kiltartan's Cross, and my countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them any loss. Whether I win in the battle or lose in the battle, it is not going to affect my poor people in my country. And then he also says, or leave them happier than before. So irrespective of what I do, fighting my enemies is not going to bring about any good or loss to my people. And then he is saying, I balanced all, brought all to mind. He had been thinking about his life and the efficacy or the effectiveness of his life. He says, I balanced all thoughts and brought to my mind. The years to come seemed a waste of breath. The future, he says, is waste of breath for me. And then he says, a waste of breath the years behind. All have been very useless for me. And then finally he concludes like this. in balance with this life, this death. And then he goes, dies. Because he never had any love in his heart. Love for the people that he was fighting, or for his own people, because his victory is not going to bring anything good for them. And therefore he was a man who had no love in his heart. And death did not make a difference to him. And that's the reason he says, in balance of this life, this death. And he goes and dies. We need to have love in our hearts to survive, to give meaning in our life. When you have love for somebody, we'll have a reason to live. And therefore the second principle of life is this: somebody to love. Somebody to love. And the third he says is, Immanuel Kant would say is, something to hope for. We need to hope, we need to have hope in life, or else it becomes despair. And despair will lead to death and despondency. We need to hope, whatever may be the circumstance in life, whatever we are facing in life, the dark things that we are facing in life will have a dawn in life. The darkness will give way to dawn. Night will break forth into the morning sunlight. That is the hope that we should always nurture in our hearts, not to get bogged down by depression. So these are the three things that he said will give us meaning in life. Something to do, someone to love, something to hope for. My dear brothers and sisters, we need to have love in our hearts. We need to have love in our hearts. Love is such a potent force. It's a very powerful force. Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit paleontologist, a scientist, and a priest. He said, after conquering the winds, the waves, and the tides, when man harnesses the energies of love, he would have discovered fire for the second time in history. That is the power of love. After conquering the winds, the waves, and tides, when man harnesses, utilizes the energies of love, he would have discovered fire for the second time in history. That is the power of love. We need to have love in our hearts. Leo Tolstoy is also a great Russian novelist, the greatest Russian novelist. He said, you are asleep if you do not fall in love. You are asleep until you fall in love, he says. We are sleeping. We have no emotions. We are not productive if you do not fall in love with something. We are called to fall in love with God, with your family members, with your children, with your neighbors. There should be love in our hearts for others. And only then we wake up from our sleep, our deep slumber. There should be love in our hearts. In today's gospel reading, we heard about which is the greatest commandment. And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. In the Old Testament, there are about 613 commandments, 248 positive commandments, according to the number of those days, according to the number of the bones and the main organs in a human person, 248, and 365 negative commandments, according to the number of the days. So that's the way they divided. So there were in total 613 commandments in the Old Testament. But who can ever remember all these commandments? Who can ever follow all these commandments? And the rabbis, the Jewish teachers themselves said, to keep all these commandments is the work of the angels. Human beings cannot keep all the commandments of the Old Testament. So many and so numerous. Nobody can ever remember. And therefore Moses summarized all these things into 10 commandments. And Prophet Micah, in chapter 6, verses 8, he summarizes all the 613 commandments into 3 commandments. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with the Lord. 3 commandments. To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with the Lord. He summarizes it into 3 commandments. But still there was a lot of confusion as to which was the most important commandment. Some of the rabbis said the commandments regarding the Sabbath, the day of the Lord, those commandments were the most important, especially the 3 meals the devout Jews indulged in. If you observe those 3 meals, then you observe all the commandments of the Old Testament, they said. And therefore the sabbatical laws were the most important commandments, they said. But the others disagreed and they said, no, the laws concerning the circumcision which a Jew has to undergo, those laws are the most important, because a Jew can circumcise his child even on a Sabbath day. So therefore, the laws concerning the circumcision supersedes even the laws of the Sabbath, and therefore those laws are more important and they are the greatest laws. And others said it's not right. They said the laws concerning the phylacteries, they are the most important. Phylacteries were kind of amulets in which on a leather piece, the commandment of God, hear, O Israel, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, were written down on the leather piece, folded and put in an amulet, and they used to tie on the forehead and on the left arm. Those are called as phylacteries. Whenever they prayed, they tied those things. They said, phylacteries, these laws are the most important, not the other laws. A man who fulfills the laws concerning the phylacteries fulfills all the laws of the Old Testament. And others came and said, even that is not necessary. The laws concerning the fringes, the prayer shawls had the fringes, 4 fringes they had. So those are the laws. A man who while praying wears those fringes fulfills all the laws. So there was a lot real at the time of Christ as to what were the laws which were most important. And therefore in today's gospel reading, we find a lawyer, a learned man, comes and asks Jesus, which is the greatest of the commandment? And Jesus says the famous Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, with all your power. Every Jew had to know this Shema by heart. And every day he recited twice this Shema. To love the Lord your God with all your mind, all your soul and all your strength. That is called as Shema. That was the most important command for any Jew, and that was Jesus cites. The mind is a place of intellect, reasoning, ideas, conviction, and therefore we have to love the Lord our God with all these intellectual powers. And also the second, Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your soul. Soul gives life to the body. And therefore a man or a woman must love God above his life. And then Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, the seat of emotion. The spiritual aspect of a man or a woman is the heart. And therefore you are called to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And that's what Jesus said. God must be given a place far above any other thing, any other person. There should be no competition to God. He should be loved from a complete perspective of a man, from his heart, from his intellect, from his soul. That's the kind of a love that we are called to have. Thomas Aquinas was a very great saint. Very great saint. He died in the year on 7th of March 1274. Very renowned scholar, but he died at the age of 49. Known for his intellect, known for his holiness also. One day when he was praying, he was around 49 years old, he was praying in the chapel. Then the sacristan wanted to see as to how he was praying in the chapel. So there was a keyhole, so he went to the keyhole and was looking at Thomas Aquinas praying in the chapel before a crucifix. And then Thomas Aquinas was levitated, was lifted up above the ground. And then the sacristan heard the words of Jesus from the cross. Thomas, Thomas, You have written so well of me. What recompense do you want to have? Jesus spoke from the cross. Thomas, Thomas, you have written well of me. Thomas has written a lot of books. Thomas, Thomas, you have written so well of me. What recompense do you like to have? And Thomas Aquinas could have asked for the Pope's cap, but he didn't ask for that. He could have asked for the cardinal's hat. Make me a cardinal, he could have said. If we were there, we would have asked for those things, but he never asked. You know what Thomas said? Lord, nothing but yourself. I don't want anything in recompense except yourself. And 3 months later, on the 7th of March, 1274, he died. That was a man who loved God with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his mind. That's the kind of a love that God wants to have in our hearts. To love Him beyond all other things. To love Him unconditionally. That is love of God, what the Bible teaches, what Jesus recommends. The second one is to love our neighbor as ourselves. To love our neighbor as ourselves. That is a corollary. It follows the first commandment. We cannot love God without loving our neighbor. Both are joined together. But for the Jews, there was a little difference. For the Jews, the neighbor was always their fellow Jew, not a Gentile. He was called to love a Jew, but he was allowed to hate his enemies, the Gentiles. But Jesus corrected that. The parable of the Good Samaritan. Your neighbor is the one who is in need. Be he of your community, of your color, of your country, doesn't matter. But if a neighbor, a human being is in need, he becomes a neighbor. And therefore you are called to love. That's the difference that Jesus brought in. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, as we participate in this Eucharist, let us ask the Lord to help us and give us the strength to love Him and to love our neighbor also. When I was in the Patrick's church long back, in the refectory we had a beautiful plaque over there with a few wordings. 3 lines were there. Very beautiful wordings. It went like this. I sought the Lord, but I could not find Him. I sought my soul, but I could not find it. I sought my neighbor, and I found all the 3. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, let us love the Lord with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, and our neighbor as ourselves, and remain blessed by God. Amen.